Metaphysical and spiritual concepts. What is unique and interesting about the consciousness-based model is that it is also capable of explaining metaphysical or spiritual concepts. We are going to discuss some of the more central and important ones. The ego. One of the most important concepts that is central and widely discussed in the spiritual traditions is the idea of the ego or the personality. Many terms have been used to describe it: separate self, illusory self, ignorant self, and so on. The concept of the ego is extremely important because all genuine spiritual practices are meant to dissolve or destroy the ego. Ultimately, the spiritual journey is nothing but the journey of the ego from its birth to death. Liberation, freedom, ultimate truth is what awaits the one whose ego is gone. What is the ego from the viewpoint of the consciousness-based model that we have just developed? When an entity is made sentient in the model, consciousness will have to be imparted to it by the self. A new version of the appearance of the cosmos will appear to the sentient being, moment to moment, with the being itself as the center. It should be noted that the body of the being is part of the cosmos. The center we are referring to is not the body itself, but a dimensionless point somewhere within the body. The source of consciousness in an appearance of the cosmos is always hidden. Birth of the ego. Since there is a body appearing now together with the cosmos, it is almost inevitable that the thought, "I am this body," will simultaneously arise. This, if believed to be true, is the actual birth of the ego. This is what is known as identification with the body. It is merely a thought, and this thought is false. To say that I am the all that appears is correct, because everything that is perceivable are appearances in my own awareness or consciousness. To say that I am none that appears is also correct, because the source of the appearance of the cosmos, including the body, is hidden and cannot be found in the appearance itself. This is similar to the dream analogy. The actual dreamer can never be found in the dream itself. But to say that I am just this body is certainly wrong and false. The ego is therefore illusory, and it follows that whatever the ego constructs thereafter is equally illusory. Growth of the ego. As long as this identification with the body lasts, the ego will grow. Every experience of the body is felt as experience to the ego. Whatever the body does, the ego will say, "I do this." Whatever happens to the body, the ego will say, "This happens to me." At every experience, the ego becomes stronger and stronger, more and more pronounced. Worldview of the ego. Another important thing to note is there is a very close link between the ego and the assumption that the world is physically real. Implicit to the thought, "I am this body," are the thoughts, "You are that body." There are those body, and those are other things. This is the basis for the idea that the world is made up of independent, separate others and material things. In other words, it is the belief of a physically real world. The more entrenched the ego is, the more rooted is this belief. Just as the ego is illusory, this perspective of a physically real world is also illusory. The appearance itself is of course real, but when it is regarded as physically real, it becomes illusory. Death of the ego. Spiritual practices in all the spiritual traditions are meant to dissolve this false idea. The dissolution or death of the ego is simply the destruction of this false and erroneous idea. It should be noted that with the destruction of the ego, there is no union of any sort with the self. there never was any separation from the self in the first place. The egoless identity. What happens when the ego is destroyed? The identification with the body of course ceases, but that doesn't mean that the being becomes insentient. Consciousness still remains. The body and all its actions are still perceived, but there is no longer any identification with it. So the personality is gone, but the identity remains. Various terms and names have been given to this egoless identity in the spiritual traditions: the knower, the wise, the sage, the liberated, and so on. Because the egoless identity no longer identifies with his body, whatever the body does, he doesn't feel that he is doing it. Whatever happens to the body, he doesn't feel that it happens to him. He will not say, "I do this." Instead, he will say, "The body does this," or "There is the doing." But in his interaction with others, he may still say, "I do this," out of convention, knowing that his audience may find it very strange if he were to say otherwise. But he himself never feels so. Worldview of the egoless. Along with the destruction of the ego, the egoic perspective that the world is physically real is also dissolved. The egoless knows that he is the consciousness in which the entire world, including his own body, appears. To him, the world is dreamlike. He is not the body. He is a dimensionless point at the center of the whole cosmos that appears. His perspective is thus very similar to the consciousness-based model that we are discussing here. Oneness. The spiritual traditions is abound with statements about oneness. There is only one. The many is merely an illusion. The many is just the self-manifestation of the one, oneness of being, and so on. In the consciousness-based model that we have developed, there are two levels in the appearances of the cosmos. At the lower level, there are many versions of the appearances of the cosmos, each occurring to a sentient being. At the higher level, which is the level of the self, it includes all the appearances at the lower level. Each sentient being at this lower level can only perceive his own version of the cosmos. If he is identified with the body, then he becomes the ego. And as we have seen above, the egoic worldview is the belief in a physically real world of the many. But the ego is an illusion. Thus, this perception of the many too is an illusion. It is just an erroneous thought. There is indeed only one, which is quite easily seen from the perspective of the higher level. The entire cosmos, including the apparently many sentient beings and things, are merely the self-manifestation of consciousness or the self, in consciousness. There is no other. There is only the one self. The all-knowing self. The self is often depicted as the all-knower, all-seer. In the model, there are two levels of the appearances of the cosmos, the higher level for the self and the lower level for all other sentient beings. At the lower level, each sentient being can only perceive his own version of the cosmos. He cannot perceive or access the appearance of the cosmos of another sentient being. But this is not the case for the self. Being the source of consciousness of all sentient beings, the appearance of the cosmos at the higher level includes all other appearances of the cosmos for each of the sentient being at the lower level. And nothing is excluded or hidden from him. He sees all, he perceives all. Whatever is seen by each sentient being, he does too, exactly as each sentient being sees it.